Hello, this is the sixth session in our course Theories of Violent Conflict, and today we'll talk about rational choice theory, the costs and benefits of war. And as you can see, I'm standing up to see if I that way energize the lecture a bit. We're going to do three things in this lecture. First, I'll say something about theories of rational choice theory of war, and particularly the work of Paul Collier and his greed theory of war. And then we're going to look into rationality, what it means to be rational, and theorize a bit on that. And finally, we place this theory in context, in the sense that we try and understand why it was so popular and still is so popular in policy circles. But normally I always start with a film or a documentary, but for rational choice theory, I really couldn't find anything that was applicable. And with that, maybe I also give away my own position on this theory of war. So the best I could come up with was a joke. It's a bit of a nerdy joke. It's Amartya Sen's joke. He's a Indian economist, a Nobel Prize winner in economy, and he's been thinking a lot about rationality and also rational choice theory. So according to his view on a world that is filled with rational choice making individuals, this would be a situation that you could come across. So where's the railway station? He asks me. There, I say, pointing at the post office. And would you please post this letter for me on the way? Yes, he says, determined to open the envelope and check whether it contains something valuable. It's a bit of a nerdy joke, but you can read it again later. Okay, so I ended by saying why in the third component part of our lecture, we're going to contextualize rational choice theory and understand why it is so influential in policy circles. And with that, we come to something that I've been stressing a lot, and that is that it is impossible for any conflict analyst to not be political or to be objective and neutral. Because as soon as we start speaking and making an analysis or write about violent conflict, we cannot escape casting blame and responsibility in some sort of way, in some direction. And with that, we enter into debates on responsibility and blame, and that is always highly sensible and sensitive and highly political. This is also what Paul Brass in his work emphasizes a lot. And it brings us to this important notion of the politics of portrayal, and that's also how I will end in the third section of this lecture. So the selection of a form and level of explanation for contemporary violent conflict is a serious political act in the sense that representations have political implications. So the way in which violent incidents and conflicts are coded and categorized will play, intentionally or not, a role in casting blame and responsibility. And we cannot escape that, and we better be sort of aware of that. And that is why I also emphasize that it's so important to have something as a critical conflict studies, where we reflect on the type of knowledge that we produce and understand that it works in the world out there, that it has an impact, and that we should be aware of that and knowledgeable, and we should reflect upon that and talk about that. So since the interpretation and representation of conflict and violence can have such enormous consequences, from letting them fight it out amongst themselves attitudes that we saw in the early 1990s when it came to, the Balkan Wars and this very strong notion that, Western powers did not want to intervene, to what we now see, sort of the remote interventionism, but also the pullback that we see today. So there's a great need to critically examine policy representation of contemporary conflict, because they have such massive consequences, the readings of violent conflict. And with that, we take upon us quite a responsibility. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that politicians will listen to us, but nevertheless, to be in this field means that we have to always address a number of very important questions about the knowledge we produce, and also about what Spivak would call epistemic violence, the violence in the knowledge that we may produce. So we have always asked ourselves these classic questions. Why do I see this violence now? What kind of us-them divides are propagated through this act of representation? What us-them divides arise out of the ways in which the violence is interpreted? And how and why is this perhaps socially meaningful to some and politically functional to others? And what are the conditions of possibility underpinning the rise to dominance of certain war images? Why do we see certain stories of wars dominate and not others? And importantly, what do I not see? What is not shown to me? And these questions inspire me very much to sort of look into remote controlled warfare and the program that I run together with Lauren Gould on the intimacies of remote warfare, very much trying to do research on the wars we do not see. So if you're interested in that, visit our website, The Intimacies of Remote Warfare, with all the products and research that we do. So that's an important sort of starting point. And it's also the starting point from which I would like to introduce you to rational choice theories of war. Because let's be upfront and straight about it, I'm not convinced at all by this particular reading and understanding of war. I'll try and present it fairly and thoroughly, but it's important for you guys to know this beforehand. And I'm particularly interested in understanding why this has become so influential and why it has become, why it's so embraced by a lot of political actors in institutions. So I'll, from the start, approach the critical rational choice theory from a critical stance. So, but let's move to this first topic. That is rational choice theories of conflict, also sometimes called the greed theory of conflict, which stands in opposition to what we talked about in our previous session, where grievances were very much underlined as the key driving force of violent conflict. So what is rational choice theory about? So what would be at its core, you'd argue? If I try to answer that question that I now pose myself, and this is what we'll do, we'll look at the core notions of rational choice theory. We look into methods, methodologies, and then look into the theory more that is underlying the method. So the core. I'd argue that rational choice theories of conflict start from the proposition that rebels will conduct a civil war if the perceived benefits outweigh the costs of rebellion. That is when we see people ready to participate in warfare. So, and immediately in a way we give away the answers to the core questions of the course. So why and how do people resort to violence? Well, as it pays, as the outcome of the cost-benefit calculation that we as individuals constantly are making tells us that this is actually a profitable way to go. And as long as war pays, conflict will be sustained. Opposing groups will even make deals to continue fighting, for instance, selling weapons to the other if that means that they can continue the war and continue to profit from this war. So what is the very important underlying assumption is that people have choice, always have choice, also in settings of war. And what we do, and here we go to who we are as human beings, we always look at the various possibilities ahead of us in our lives and their costs, and then we make a choice. So we always look for the most attractive course of action. And with that, we are utility maximizers always. The individual is a utility maximizers in all settings of life. That is the ontological position, very strongly advocated by rational choice theory. And this is also applied then to war. this notion that we are utility maximizers also in settings of precarity and also settings of civil war. So let's have a look at the work of this set of authors that make use of this underlying assumption and through that approach violent conflict, or particularly civil wars, and particularly civil wars in Africa, because that's a subset of of data that particularly this strand of theorizing has focused on over the past decades. What they do is they clearly fit into the epistemological position of the explanatory model. So they don't believe, or they don't go by what people say and would argue. They are why they are engaged in violent conflict, because they could say basically anything is the position. Rational choice theory of war very much looks at patterns of behavior to understand motivations of people. And that's also very strongly outlined in the piece by Paul Collier himself. So it doesn't make sense to listen to what people say and why they are engaged in war. We have to look at what they do, and that really tells us the real reasons and the real motivations. So what rational choice theorists would engage in is first define greed as in their hypothesis the main driver of violent conflict, and that is the aspiration to wealth through extra legal attainment of resources. Maybe it's good to point that out, what is meant by greed in the greed theory of violence. And that is strongly the underlying hypothesis, that it is greed that is driving war and it's not grievances that is driving war. But how do they get to the evidence that supports this hypothesis? That's what we're going to look at now. Because that's pretty hard to test, right? Whether it's greed or grievances that is at hand or is the key motivator in war. So how do you define greed, and how do you study greed, and how do you make a case that it is actually greed and not grievance? So to really able to do that, we have to find, causality links. So the method that is applied in testing whether indeed it is greed that is driving civil wars, and if indeed this is done, and that's the approach taken by rational choice theory, that is done through quantitative statistical big data analysis, then how to establish from all these data causal relationships. That can only be done by setting up proxies. Since greed or grievance as such, as a phenomena, is very hard to measure, these theorists, these academics have to set up proxies to actually measure when they think greed is at work and when they think grievances are at work. So they have to find indicators that stand in for this more vague notion of greed or grievance, through which they then can actually start counting and measuring whether the one or the other is at hand, is what we see. So, and that's important if you want to understand these more quantitative approaches to violent conflict. And I would want to motivate you to make this effort, because it's really important that you can speak the language, you can understand how it's built, so you can relate to it. Again, you have to understand the importance of the proxies that are being set up through which this research then is being done. So we cannot quantify greed, that's hard. So instead we have to set up indirect measures that are quantifiable, so that are countable and measurable, to stand in for this notion of greed and also for the notion of grievance. And that is what we call a proxy. So something that is measurable and that can indirectly measure what it is exactly that we are after. Now, in the case of Paul Collier's research on civil war, he set out to to proxy greed, as we would argue, by looking at the percentage of young men in a country, the percentage of commodity exports, and the average years of schooling. And to him, these three factors stand in for this more slippery word that is greed. So if there's high percentages of young men, there's a lot of high percentages of commodity export, and there's a very low average years of schooling. Together, for him, that would set a context in which it would be profitable to engage in looting and greeding behavior. And through these proxies, then we can measure greed. So that is basically the crux of the model of Collier. So what then happens is, first there's a hypothesis which is greed is more important than grievances in explaining, in driving civil war. Then proxies, variables are set up. So these sets of indicators, and then these can then be tested out by data gathering on all these different variables across different samples. And then the next step is to see what is the correlation between the outbreak or the existence of civil war and having these three factors, ingredients, so to say, existing at the same time. And if there's a high correlation, a convincing high correlation, you could say, well, these then are pretty robust findings. And that's exactly what Kramer came up with in his research. In the book, you can read it more in detail. He set up proxies for grievances as well. He put them to the test. He ran them through his statistical data sets, and he convincingly showed that grievances are of no importance in explaining civil war, whereas the greed components are overwhelmingly apparent in settings of civil war. And through that, he came to the conclusion that it's overwhelmingly and exclusively greed that is driving civil wars, and grievances are really completely unimportant. Now, there's been a lot of critique on this method, also from within the methodology and the set of academics within this approach themselves. There's a lot of debate on how weak the proxies are, how easily these proxies, the young man proportion, commodity export percentage, and the years of schooling could also stand in to test grievances, because if in countries where this is the case, generally there's a very low development, and therefore there could be a lot of social anger about not having access to school. Or think about Azar with all his stories that he could build his whole model of protracted social conflict based on these proxies in a way. So the proxies are wrong, and that is a big debate in these types of conflict studies, conferences where people are bickering about the wrong or the right proxies. There's also debate about this binary of greed and grievance as sort of two some completely different motivations, whereas in practice they are much more they much more interact and mutually constituent. And there's also a lot of critique on bad data, that particularly in Africa, the data sets are weak, but also the country level upon which these methods are applied. So this is Rwanda or Sudan or Kenya, is actually not very helpful, because we should look at much more sub-state regions to really explain the more micro politics of violence that's going on. So there's a lot of critique on this method, and actually it's been, you could argue that this particular approach is considered pretty flawed, also within among colleagues of this rational choice theory approach. So instead of spending a lot of words on this and on proxies and bad data, I want to move to the theory that is used to actually explain the high correlation that Collier found in his proxies and the outbreak of civil war. So how does he make sense of that high relationship or that significant relationship? So how is he theorizing? How is he making sense of that? And there, is trying to argue a causal relationship. For us, I think that is for the moment more interesting. So let's move to the theory of rational choice theory. What Collier is trying to convince us about is that for the utility maximizer, so that is the view on the human being, the cost of taking part in a grievance-based rebellion outweighs the benefits. So although there may be very strong and good reasons to be very grieved about a whole set of issues, and people deeply feel frustrated and angry, and perhaps also feel that their needs are being deprived, they won't take action based upon grievances. And the reason why that is because of the massive collective action problems that come with starting a grievance-based rebellion. So starting, for instance, if we think back to the Battle of Algiers, joining into a high risk rebellion where the chances of getting caught and getting killed and getting tortured and fail are extremely high. So despite the fact that people may have serious reasons and angers in all kinds of societies, those angers will never translate into collective action for rebellion because there's not enough benefits in them. And that is why, because there is such huge problems. And these problems are already pretty old in terms of a theory that's old by Mancor Olsen, who outlines this notion of collective action problem. So let's look into what those problems then are that prevent people from taking part in a grievance-based rebellion. We're still here with Collier's logic. There's a very important question in conflict studies, and we've been addressing it throughout the sessions, and that is, why do people follow? Why would people follow certain elites who want to steer them up and warmonger them into hating their neighbors? But also, why would people risk joining a rebel movement or a large demonstration, as we now see in Hong Kong and in Minsk? Isn't that awfully risky? Yes, it is. And there's even, on top of being risky, there's actually three different types of risks that people are considering before they actually engage in any kind of rebellion. And that blocks them from engaging in most rebellions that are based on grievances. So the first big problem is free riding. Most grievance-based wars are about collective goods. So overthrowing a dictator, but it could also be justice or clear water or any other, or security. So these collective goods are often what these types of demonstrations and rebellions are about, removing the colonial oppressor, for instance. But the problem is that although I may want to, indeed, I strongly support that political goal, and I want to enjoy that public good of democracy and independence, it doesn't really matter so much whether I, as an individual, participate in that struggle. I could just wait it out, sit it out, and then have others take the chance and the risk, and then if they're successful, I can enjoy that public good anyway. So that is the free riding argument, and the reason why most people sort of sit back and have others risk their lives and then hope they may later on enjoy the gains of the revolution or the transformation that people fight for. The second big problem is coordination. Again, it's very hard to set up a rebellion, certainly in a dictatorial regime or in a colonial oppressive regime, as we saw. So rebellions have to start somewhere, and they start in small cells and small groups. But because they're small, the chance of getting caught and picked out and indeed put on this blackboard, remember that we saw in the film, and have your name jotted down and being tortured and killed, is pretty high if you start a small rebellion. So the individual would rather join a larger, bigger movement. Only when there's a serious mass will people actually overcome their fears and join the bigger mass. But to set up a rebellion is extremely risky, and therefore people simply are not going to join these types of rebellions that are grievance based or political. And very closely related to that is the time inconsistency problem. Because rewards will take a long time. It will be a very long struggle. And as one of the main figures, if you can recall, in the Battle of Algiers, is referring to, the problem only really starts, the difficulties only really start after the revolution has been won. So before that happens, and after the revolution even has been won, it takes a long time before you can actually profit or enjoy the collective goods of democracy and stability and freedom. So the reward will take forever, and probably even you will not see it in your own lifetime, and that also makes it very unattractive for people to join in. There's no rewards. So greed motivated rebels, if they would look into these problems, or no, I'm not saying it right, and maybe this is not exactly how it should be. These problems are so large, the collective action problems, that it's very hard to start a rebellion based on a political agenda for collective good. But since we are all utility maximizers, if we can join a rebellion which directly gives us rewards, then this might actually be very tempting, and through that we could actually overcome all these problems. Because if we can from the start engage in looting and enriching ourselves by becoming part of a rebellion, a greed-based rebellion, we don't want to be, have others do the fighting and the engagement, because we want to be part of the rebellion so we can get to the loot. Also, it's even better to have a small group, because then you have a bigger chance of getting more from more profit. And time inconsistency is not a problem, because you can have instant rewards. So that's why greed motivated rebellions, not rebels, rebellion, overcome all these collective action problems. Grievance-based rebellions cannot deliver, and therefore often fail. So we don't see them. So the type of civil wars that we see in Africa, for instance, that is the continent that Collier was focusing on, are all driven by greed. So if that is indeed the case, from that we see that in this type of understanding and this binary of greed and grievance and this sort of assessment of motivation and causality, is painting a picture of violent conflicts as markets, and as individuals in violent conflict as constantly calculating whether it would or would not pay off to step into the market of violent conflict. So individuals make investments in violence and reap private returns. So the market of grievance-based conflict shows simply that, it's an imperfect market. You could invest in it, but you're not going to get anything back. You can invest your life and your safety and your family, but you probably will not in your lifetime see any change. You put into a lot of costs without benefits, a lot of risks without compensation. So you just don't do it. So although real enough, And that's not being debated. So sometimes Collier is being critiqued for the wrong reasons. He's not saying there's no such thing as grievances in people's lives, but they won't act upon it. They won't start a rebellion because it doesn't pay to start rebellion out of grievances. Grievances cannot produce sufficient rebellion. So that is a very strong argument that he makes. Now, it's not very hard to see, only if we just have the case of the Battle of Algiers in the back of our minds, to see that there's room for critique here. There's room for critique a priori, so beforehand, by simply dismissing this whole underlying notion of the individual only driven by utility maximization. So just that, as a fundamental rejection of using this model that was made up by Olson for largely economic transactions, and then to just transplant that onto a very complicated social complex as civil war is stupid and is not fit for that. That's what's, the people who critique this approach just say from the start. So, and then the issue of rationality and violence is also very debatable. And then there's other researchers who come up with evidence which shows that it's actually, the attitudes of people to use violence are very ambiguous and ambivalent and complex, and it's silly to treat violence as an unambiguous cost. And if you read the work by Nicholson and Tarrow and Jabri, and particularly also the work of Christopher Kramer and the article that's in the reader pack, you get a very sophisticated critique on that. Also outlined in the book. So, because, and there goes Amartya Sen again, maybe then now the joke resonates more. This is then the world that Paul Collier is telling us we are in, where everyone is a utility maximizer. So where's the railway station? Somebody asked me. Well, then I say it's over there, so you can post this letter for me on the way. And then he says, yes, of course. And he looks into my envelope to see if there's something valuable. That's the world of utility maximization. And that's too shallow a model for understanding human conduct. Okay, so that's the first part. We looked at Paul Collier's work and the critiques on his work. But I want to dig a little deeper and go into a second topic, and that is the rationality and rational choice theory, because there's something to be taken out of that we can, I think, that is valuable for our type of research. So let's look at this notion of rationality. So how do we calculate maximum utility? If someone makes a correct calculation and acts on it, so what does it mean to be rational? And can we be completely rational in the sense that we as was referred in the joke, we constantly in all settings always think about how we get to the most beneficial outcome for every act we are engaged in? And can we actually do that? Can we be such a, have these computers in our head, make these calculations and then act upon it all the time as if we're being sort of rational, self-contained beings? So all these kind of questions pop up. Is not being rational also always bounded by the roles we play in society and by the norms that tell us how to do social life? So sometimes we have to take these into account too, if we want to understand whether it's a rational thing to act in a certain way or not. So if we want to understand that, should we not study these also in order to understand how individuals then act? So the more we think about rational action, the more confusing it becomes. Because we're always situated in larger settings and contexts and communities, and we always play different roles, and these roles also define whether it is in certain circumstances beneficial to act in certain ways. But then to understand what is rational, we have as researchers to understand how a person is playing a certain role and how in the context of that role it actually is rational or not to do something and not something else. And that sort of refers us back to understanding how this actor operates in a larger scripted society that tells him how to do social life. And then the more we think about it, the more we're back into understanding the organization of society and how important that is to understand what it is to be rational. So we sort of move away from zooming into the individual with his little computer calculating cost and benefits constantly, and individual cost and benefits, to seeing, well, but that individual really doesn't exist, because then he would be the Amartya Sen person who would be, put in jail or considered a lunatic. So we have to position that individual in a more complex society, and then we have also to study the rules of that society to establish whether something is rational or not. And from that, we start moving in different directions of research. So, and exactly that is what sort of brings us to different notions of rational action, where there's a very, very thin one, and that is what the rational choice of Paul Collier and the model that is sort of central to his greed theory, where rational choice, where rational action means instrumentally rational choice by an always self-contained individual unit with his computer or her computer calculating, with any elements fed into that computer influencing the calculations of payoffs as seen by this agent. So people's actions, including violent actions, are then explained by utility only and motivated only by utility and by the computer calculating. Where therefore the position of that person in a larger context is not taken into account in understanding his or her action as being rational. And the second understanding of rationality is much more complicated. We call it a thick one, where we do take into account that we're also always playing roles, and we are situated, and we can reflect on that and then try and negotiate and maneuver our way through these obligations and try and act in our own beneficial ways, but not like a little maniac computer. So that is much more rational action as intelligent obedience, perhaps we could call it, to the rules of the game and the roles that we play. So the individual here is much more situated with a lot of room for agency, for self-reflective direction and moral and normative engagement, but motivated not just by utility, but also by the implications of acting in certain ways and how that then will have, negative or positive impacts on the individual. So the whole notion of normality and norms becomes very important. So the individual here is still a purposeful agent, but he's enabled and constrained by the rules and the norms of the society that he lives in. So this is a very different narrative about the individual in society, and that sort of brings us to, if we would go and look at the Hollis matrix, we actually find, if this is the Hollis matrix, we find that each of these boxes tell a different story about who we are as human beings. So the upper right box, remember, where structures are so important, we've discussed that earlier, where all the organization of society is driving us into certain forms of behavior. That's where the Homo sociologicus lives. And for the Homo sociologicus, it is rational to follow rules, always, to be a sheep, basically. And in the left box, the bottom left box, that's where the Homo economicus lives. This is the ultimate utility maximizer who is only arguing from the individual position and is constantly calculating individual utility. So that's where Collier lives, basically. And then we see that the more thick understanding of rationality is on the right bottom corner of the matrix, and that is where perhaps Homo politicus is, who is still a rational being, capable of deliberating and maneuvering and negotiating through moral reflection, but still has agency, is not a sheep, is not simply following the rules, such as the guys upstairs, but can maneuver and negotiate the rules, but also has to do that in a intelligent way. But here's the potential for change and reflection and deliberation. So here we see three very different stories about who we are, and we'll see that indeed in the theories that we've discussed, these notions of the human being are embraced by different authors in different ways. So indeed, the contemporary subject, who are we? Or what have we become, perhaps? You know, are we now the Homo economicus only? Sort of what we talked about earlier, is this what Benry Brown tells us, that we've been subjected into the Homo economicus, and we've become self-investing humans that are only concerned with their own utility maximization? Or are we Homo sociologicus, and are we largely sheepishly follow the rules that tell us how to do social life, and never ever anything will ever change, or perhaps very gradually? Or are we Homo politicus, which is actually what Wendy Brown in her book hopes we are, from a sort of Aristotelian view. That is, we are defined by a political nature which issues from human capacities of moral reflection, reflexivity, deliberation and expression, and association making. So we are that. So that's what a lot of philosophers and a lot of debates, talk about and think about. But actually we should do too, because we see that underlying a lot of the theories of violent conflict, one of these three views on who we are as contemporary subject is actually dominating the story. Okay, so that's something to ponder on, and we'll come back to that in the final session more, and perhaps we'll get more of a refined answer to who we are, perhaps. Okay, I want to go to the last point, and that is why this theory of rational choice is so much embraced in the world today, and why it is so popular in the policymaking world. I'm going to say something very brief about that, because time is flying, and it's also something that you could easily read. Well, it's very attractive, the Greek theory of war, because it comes with these hard figures, and that's what a lot of policymakers actually like, this kind of robustness that it sort of, the feel of robustness that it brings. It is a monocausal explanation of war. It's a very simple one, which is also sometimes a strong point. There's a lack of time. It's got a good slogan, it's the silent force of greed that is driving civil war. And it definitely has strong points in the sense that the economy for a very long time was not addressed in these models of civil war for a long time. And in a way, that's one of the good things, that Paul Collier brought the economy and economic drivers of violent conflict back into the equation. Another helpful thing is that it very much disagrees with the view that, the primordialist ancient hatreds is what brings a civil war. and also this notion that conflict is always dysfunctional and irrational, and it's fought by bloodthirsty barbarians and primitives. Instead, what it actually shows is that conflict is actually a pretty rational process, and serves a lot of economic functions in certain regions of the world. Now, the trouble is that those economic motives are only placed on particular non-state greedy actors, rebels or terrorists, and are not, not all the other actors, such as NGOs or states or state representatives or international institutions, somehow don't have that quality of greed, which makes it a very unbalanced model. But if we would apply that, perhaps, and bring in this notion not of utility maximization, because that's a too shallow understanding of the human being, but understanding how indeed following the money and following how wars are financed and how wars are actually alternative systems of profit very often is extremely interesting, and that, I have to admit, is something that was put back on the agenda, maybe through the wrong type of theory, but it's back, and is important to keep it. But as I said, it's mostly been and still sort of around in policy circles because it has been very helpful in political ways. It basically came at the right moment. It sort of presented a policy answer to a very inconvenient setting, and it gave us the story that it's actually local rebels who are in it for greed that are at the source of most violent conflicts in the world today, and it's therefore not the larger systems, and it's not the failing international institutions and structural adjustment programs that are partly to blame for why, for instance, in post-communist and post-colonial settings, there is so much, indeed, a high incidence of war taking place. So read that in the book. But the basic point is that why the greed theory of violent conflict was so helpful was that it gave the right answer at the right moment, when the policy world was very much looking for a good story to show who was actually to blame for the increase. Remember the graph that I showed you in the first session, the increase in disorder and instability in a lot of the global south, which just went through a radical neoliberal reform. So, and that is why it's been, strongly embraced by a lot of policymakers, because it directs attention to the local evil and not the systemic and structural organization of the global economy, for instance, as the cause of violence in the world today. So maybe to simplify it a little, it casts blame and responsibility at the level of the local actor. So the greed theory of civil war argues that it's not grievance but greed which drives civil war, and that sort of is very helpful because greed is then simply a bad quality that has to be taken out. Whereas grievance, if it would have been grievances such as Azar and Gert told us last session, the grievances are always relational in the sense that, they refer to an outside. There's always another who is causing grievances, and it's a much more complex story to map and understand and act upon. And that was sort of not very convenient at the time. So to conclude, we see very, very different views on what makes civil wars. And again, this is a discussion, the discussion I now talked about, that is very much geared to the civil wars that happened in the 1990s and after in the African continent. So the greed theory of war brought us this story that is the local evil that is at the source of this. So therefore, if that is the case, we can, hunt down the criminals and put them to trial or eradicate them, and send in, the military interventions that perhaps need to be doing that. Whereas if we talk from a more grievance-based, or systemic analysis of what is causing civil war, and how all kinds of global processes help to create gray zones that we talked about earlier, that is a much more diffuse and more complex and very hard for policymakers to deal with type of answer to what makes war in the world. So again, we see that the interpretation of conflict, the interpretation of what drives violence, has important policy implications. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that we as researchers have to be highly aware of that political landscape in which we operate. And we have to have an eye for the interpretations of violence and their consequences. And also study why some of the stories, some of the theories of violent conflict are embraced by policymakers and international organizations, and why others are not. So with that, this is the session on rational choice theories of violent conflict. Our next session will be about the discursive approach to violence and structurationism. So, and there we'll go into this debate about society and individuality. We'll take that one step further. Okay, bye-bye.